Mark Reynolds arrived before sunrise, as he always did. The military complex still slept in darkness, its corridors filled with the hum of distant generators and the smell of metal and disinfectant. His boots echoed softly on the polished floor while the world outside still yawned in pale blue light. Every morning was the same. Arrive early, clean quietly, leave unseen. People came and went with clipped voices and pressed uniforms, but to them he was invisible. They passed him like he was part of the wall, just another maintenance tool in a world built on orders and ranks. And that suited Mark fine. He didn't want attention. He wanted peace. His uniform was faded, the patch on his chest half peeled, his old wristwatch scratched from years of use. Yet he kept everything clean. Shoes shined, tools in order, floors spotless. He worked like a man who owed the world something, but no one ever asked what. To the young officers, he was just a middle-aged janitor with tired eyes and calloused hands. They joked that he was probably here for the free meals, or that he had nowhere else to go. Some called him Ghost, thinking it funny that he appeared and disappeared without a sound. None of them knew how close that word came to the truth. That particular morning buzzed with tension. The base commander had announced an inspection by a newly appointed general, Aurora Kane. She was the youngest woman to reach her rank, known across divisions for her discipline and sharp tongue. Stories about her circulated like storm rumors, that she'd once demoted a captain for a crooked salute, that she could spot a lie from across a parade ground, that she ran her units like a steel machine. Everyone feared her arrival. Everyone except Mark. He just continued polishing the marble floor outside the conference room, his motions calm and steady. As dawn crept through the high windows, officers lined up nervously, straightening jackets and whispering last-minute excuses to one another. Mark stepped aside, wiping the handle of his mop with an old rag, pretending not to hear their panic. But in truth, he had seen countless inspections before. He knew how fear worked in military buildings. It rolled downhill, and the janitor was always at the bottom. The sound of heels clicking echoed down the hallway like gunfire. Aurora Kane entered with 2 aides at her side, her uniform crisp, medals shining against her dark coat. She moved like a blade, precise, cutting, impossible to ignore. Her gaze swept over the line of officers, evaluating everything. "Too stiff," she muttered to one. "Too nervous," to another. Her voice was firm but controlled, each word landing with authority. When she reached Mark's end of the hall, her sharp eyes caught the old mop leaning against the wall. She frowned slightly. "Who left cleaning equipment in the inspection corridor?" One of the junior officers stammered. That belongs to the janitor, he's right there." Mark turned, wiping his hands on his cloth. "Sorry. I was just finishing up." Aurora's brows rose. Finishing up. She looked him over, the worn uniform, the lined face, the old wristwatch ticking quietly. "Next time," she said coldly, "try not to smell like the basement." A few young officers chuckled under their breath. Mark simply nodded, his face calm. "Yes, He bent down to pick up a folder that had slipped from one of their hands. As he did, his sleeve rolled up slightly, revealing a faded tattoo near his forearm. A dark emblem of a hawk with folded wings and a sword broken through the center. Aurora's words caught in her throat. Her gaze locked on the mark, her eyes widening just enough for her aides to notice. For a brief second, her perfectly trained posture faltered. She stared like she was seeing a ghost. That symbol. It couldn't be. It was the insignia of the Ghost Hawks, an elite task force disbanded years ago after a classified mission gone wrong. Every soldier who had ever worn that mark was listed as KIA, killed in action. Mark noticed her staring but said nothing. He pulled his sleeve down, picked up the folder, and handed it to the nearest officer. "You dropped this," he said softly. Aurora blinked, collecting herself. "Thank you," she managed, her tone tight. Then, quickly, she turned away. "Proceed with inspection," she ordered. But her voice lacked its usual sharpness. As the group moved on, Mark returned to his cleaning. Yet his hands trembled slightly as he wrung out the mop. The tattoo burned faintly beneath his sleeve, as if the past itself had heard its name whispered again. The rest of the inspection went on, though Aurora barely heard the reports her aides read. Her mind raced backward through time, to desert winds and night operations, to a team that moved like shadows and vanished like smoke. The Ghost Hawks. Her husband, Captain David Kane, had served under their command before his death. He used to speak of their leader with quiet reverence, a man who saved entire squads and never left a comrade behind. A man known only by his call sign, Shadow One. But Shadow One had died years ago. She'd read the report herself. She'd attended the memorial, even laid a rose on the empty casket. The name listed beside it still lingered in her memory like a scar. Captain Mark Reynolds, deceased, hero of Operation Silent Dusk. Her heart thudded painfully. It couldn't be him. The file said the body was never recovered, that he'd died protecting his men. But the face she saw today, older, weathered, there was something familiar in the eyes. The same quiet sadness. The same patience her husband had described whenever he'd spoken of his friend. After the inspection ended, Aurora dismissed her aides and walked alone into her office. She shut the door and leaned against it, her breath trembling. She had faced hostile generals, war zones, and political battles without flinching. But that single glance in the hallway had shaken her to her core. She walked to her desk and pulled out a file from the lower drawer labeled Classified, Ghost Hawks. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded. Photographs of young soldiers stared back at her. Smiling, fearless, ghosts trapped in time. Her fingers stopped on one photo, a group standing together under a helicopter. In the middle stood a tall man with a faint grin, his arm around her husband. His eyes, even in black and white, carried warmth and sorrow mixed together. Beneath the photo, the name read, Reynolds, Mark, Shadow One. Aurora sank into her chair. "It can't be," she whispered. "It just can't." Meanwhile, down below, Mark stored his cleaning cart in the maintenance room. The door closed behind him, muffling the noise of boots and voices. The small space was dim, lined with old lockers and chemical shelves. He sat on the bench, taking a deep breath, then rolled up his sleeve to stare at the tattoo again. The ink was faded, scarred, but still sharp enough to bring memories flooding back. Memories he'd spent a decade trying to bury. He could still hear the desert wind, the crackle of comms in his ear, the screams of his brothers when the mission went wrong. He saw fire lighting up the night sky, the explosion that tore through their transport, the sand turning red. They'd called for extraction, but it never came. Command had gone silent. He'd dragged as many as he could to safety, but when dawn broke, there was nothing left. No signal, no rescue, only silence and smoke. He remembered the promise he made to David Kane before the final firefight. "If I don't make it," David had said, gripping his shoulder, "take care of her. She's strong, but she'll carry the weight alone." Mark had laughed back then. "You'll tell her yourself." But David hadn't. When the rescue team finally arrived days later, Mark had been barely conscious. They told him his unit was gone, that the files were sealed, that the world had already mourned them. And for reasons he never understood, Command listed him among the dead too. Maybe it was cleaner that way. Heroes died, survivors disappeared. He didn't argue. He just vanished, too tired to correct them. He had come here years later under a false work name, not for revenge or recognition, but because this was where David's wife had been stationed. He'd kept his distance, content to watch from the shadows, to make sure she was safe. He had honored his promise in silence. Until today, when fate decided to drag him out of it. The creak of the maintenance door pulled him back. A young lieutenant poked his head in. "Hey, old man. You missed a spot in the hallway near the briefing room." His tone was mocking. Mark smiled faintly. "I'll get it," he said. The lieutenant smirked and left. Mark stood slowly, rolling down his sleeve again, the tattoo hidden once more. As he walked through the corridors, whispers followed him. Some called him basement ghost, others just laughed. He didn't care. He'd been called worse by men with guns. Upstairs, Aurora sat by her window, staring down at the courtyard. Soldiers moved like ants below, neat rows, perfect discipline. Yet her mind wasn't on them. She was thinking about the man cleaning her floors. She opened her computer and typed his name into the personnel system. Mark Reynolds. The file that appeared was almost blank. No birth record, no next of kin, no prior service. Just a hiring date from 5 years ago. She frowned. "Who are you?" she whispered. That night, after most of the building had emptied, Mark returned to his small apartment near the base. It was barely furnished, a single bed, a wooden table, a kettle, and a photo frame. Inside the frame was an old picture of his unit, the Ghost Hawks, smiling in the desert sun. Next to it was another photo, smaller, of a woman holding a child. He looked at them both for a long time before setting the frame down. "Almost done, boys," he murmured. "Almost kept my promise." Outside, the street was quiet, but in the distance he could hear thunder rolling over the city. He closed his eyes. Somewhere above, under the same storm, a general stared at the same sky, wondering if ghosts truly ever stayed buried. The next morning, as the sun broke through the clouds, Aurora arrived early again. She walked through the corridors with a strange mix of authority and unease. When she passed the janitor's closet, she paused. The door was slightly open, the faint sound of humming coming from inside, a tune old soldiers used to whistle on long marches. Her breath caught. She remembered her husband humming that same melody years ago. She stepped closer, her heart pounding. Mark turned when he heard the footsteps. "Good morning," he said, calm as ever. Aurora looked at him for a long time, searching his face. "That tattoo," she said finally, her voice low but firm. "Where did you get it?" Mark wiped his hands on his rag and looked her in the eye. "Long time ago," he said. "Different world." Her eyes narrowed. "You're not answering my question." He smiled faintly. "That's because you're not ready to hear the answer." She froze, unsure what to say. There was something in his tone, gentle, but unyielding, that made her step back. "Who are you?" she whispered. Mark didn't reply. He simply picked up his cart, pushed it past her, and said softly, "Just someone cleaning up what's left." As he disappeared down the hall, Aurora felt her knees weaken. The echo of his steps lingered long after he turned the corner. She looked down at her trembling hand, realizing her heart was pounding not from fear, but from recognition. And as the lights above flickered on, illuminating the spotless floor he'd just cleaned, Aurora Kane finally whispered to herself, "That can't be real." Aurora Kane couldn't sleep that night. The image of that tattoo burned behind her eyes like an afterimage she couldn't blink away. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it. That hawk with its folded wings and broken sword, carved deep into the skin of a janitor who shouldn't have existed. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the hum of the air conditioner sounding like the drone of old helicopters in her memory. She had faced enemy generals, interrogated spies, seen men die in battle. Yet it was a quiet old man with tired eyes and a broom who haunted her thoughts. When dawn crept through the blinds, she sat up and exhaled deeply. Logic told her it couldn't be true. The Ghost Hawks were gone, a legend buried in classified files and old soldiers' stories. Still, her gut whispered otherwise. She'd learned long ago never to ignore that feeling. At the base, the morning buzzed with routine. Boots striking floors, commands echoing, young officers laughing near the canteen. But beneath it all was a hum of tension. People had started whispering about her strange behavior the previous day. The way she had frozen mid-inspection, the way her usual fire had dimmed. Aurora didn't care. She walked straight into her office and locked the door behind her. Her fingers hesitated over the computer keyboard. She knew what she was about to do was against protocol, but she needed answers. She accessed the internal personnel system, typing in Mark Reynolds. The file popped up instantly, but it was almost empty. Name, employee number, date of hire, 5 years ago. No background, no previous employment, no family, no history before that. It was like the man had stepped out of thin air. Aurora frowned. "That's not possible," she muttered. Every employee had a record, birth certificate, address, at least some trace of existence. But Mark Reynolds was a ghost. She clicked the Access Military Records tab, her clearance allowing her deeper entry. After a moment, a red warning flashed on screen, access restricted. Level 7 authorization required. She leaned back in her chair, whispering to herself. Level 7? Only Central Command keeps those. That meant the man cleaning her hallways had a file locked at the same level as top-secret weapon systems. Her phone buzzed, her assistant calling from outside. Are you joining the morning briefing? Aurora stared at the screen, her mind racing. Tell them I'm reviewing field reports, she said flatly, ending the call. Then she picked up her coat and left. Half an hour later, she stood in the archive basement. A cold, dimly lit place where dust floated like old secrets. The archivist on duty looked startled when she arrived. General Kane, he said quickly, straightening. What brings you down here? I need access to restricted personnel logs, she said. The man hesitated. That's. She cut him off with a sharp look. You know who I am. Give me the file. He swallowed hard, nodded, and disappeared behind a metal gate. Minutes passed before he returned, holding a thin, sealed folder marked confidential. Deceased personnel, Operation Silent Dusk. Aurora took it with trembling hands. The edges were worn, the ink faded, but one line stood clear near the top. Name, Captain Mark Reynolds, status, KIA, confirmed by DNA. Her stomach twisted. She flipped the pages, scanning rapidly through mission summaries and casualty lists. The Ghost Hawks had been sent to extract hostages from enemy territory, but something had gone wrong. According to the report, an explosion destroyed their transport, killing everyone on board. No bodies were recovered. Later, a burnt dog tag was found, enough to declare Reynolds dead. She stared at the date, 10 years ago. 10 years. The same time he vanished from all records. She closed the file, her heartbeat hammering. It didn't make sense. DNA confirmation could be faked, especially in chaos. And yet, why would anyone fake his death? She left the archives in silence, walking through the empty corridors. Every step echoed like a heartbeat. She thought about her late husband, David Kane, the man she'd loved, the soldier who'd once served under Reynolds. He had spoken about his commander often, calling him the kind of man who never left anyone behind. After David's death, she had buried that part of her heart along with him. But now, the same man who had fought beside him was mopping her floors? It was too much to process. That evening, she went to the memorial wall at the courtyard, a massive black stone etched with names of fallen soldiers. She traced her fingers along the engraved letters of her husband's name, Captain David Kane. The marble was cold beneath her touch. Then her eyes shifted to the name below it, Captain Mark Reynolds. Her chest tightened. She whispered, "Why are you still alive?" Behind her, footsteps echoed softly. She turned. It was Mark, holding a small bucket and rag. His face was calm, unreadable, the same quiet patience in his eyes. "You shouldn't be here this late," he said gently. Aurora's voice came out sharper than she intended. "I could say the same to you." He smiled faintly. "Old habits. Can't leave things dirty." She stared at him, emotions swirling, confusion, anger, disbelief. "Who are you, really?" she demanded. Mark looked at the wall beside her, his gaze softening at the engraved names. Just someone paying his respects. Her frustration broke. "Don't play games with me, Mr. Reynolds," she snapped. "I've read the reports. I've seen your file. You're supposed to be dead." He didn't react. He just looked at her with those steady, sorrowful eyes. "Reports lie sometimes." Aurora's voice trembled. "You knew my husband, didn't you?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he nodded once. "Yes, better than most." Her throat tightened. "You served together in Ghost Hawks." He nodded again. "We were brothers." Her breath caught. "Then why hide? Why this?" She gestured at his janitor's uniform. "Why let everyone think you're just some cleaner?" Mark looked down at his hands. Rough, scarred, calloused. Because sometimes it's easier to be invisible, he said softly. When people think you're gone, they stop expecting things from you. They stop asking questions you can't answer. Aurora stepped closer, her voice breaking. You could have told me. You could have told me you were alive. He met her eyes, for the first time, his calm cracked, and pain flickered through. And say what? That I lived while he didn't? That I broke my promise? Her lips parted. Promise. Mark exhaled slowly. Your husband made me promise I'd take care of you if something happened. I thought he'd make it back. But when he didn't, his voice faded, rough with memory. I came here to keep an eye on you. That's all. I didn't want you to know. You deserve to move on, to live without the ghosts. Aurora stood frozen, tears forming in her eyes. You've been here all these years, watching. He nodded. Not watching, just making sure. The silence between them was heavy, thick with the weight of everything unsaid. The wind whispered through the courtyard, rustling the flags above them. Aurora's tears slipped down her cheek before she could stop them. All this time, I thought you were gone. I thought he was alone when he died. Mark's voice was quiet but sure. He wasn't. He died a hero, Aurora. I tried to bring him home. But Command left us out there. They called it a failed mission, but it wasn't us who failed. She covered her mouth, her breath shaking. They lied to me, she whispered. All of them lied. Mark nodded. They lied to all of us. For a while, neither spoke. The night had grown darker, the moon glinting off the engraved names like silver tears. Finally, Aurora said, Why come back now? Why stay? He looked at her with quiet strength. Because promises don't end when wars do. Her heart twisted. You kept yours. He smiled faintly, but there was no joy in it. I tried. That's all any of us ever do. She took a step closer. You could have been so much more, Mark. You could have rebuilt your life. He looked at the broom beside him, then back at her. Maybe this is rebuilding. Sometimes cleaning up after others is the only way to live with what's left. Aurora's voice softened. You're not just a janitor. No, he said quietly. But it's a simple title. And I've learned simple isn't so bad. The courtyard fell silent again. The sound of a distant trumpet from the barracks drifted through the air, the last note of the day's salute. Aurora stood beside him, both looking at the wall in silence. Finally, she whispered, You can't hide forever. He nodded. I know, but I can stay long enough to finish what he started. She looked at him, the anger gone now, replaced by something like respect and sorrow. When she turned to leave, Mark looked back at the names one last time, his fingers brushing over David Kane's carved letters. Rest easy, brother, he murmured. I kept my word. As Aurora walked away, her steps slow and heavy, she glanced back once. Mark stood alone under the cold light, the janitor who wasn't a janitor, the soldier who carried his ghosts in silence. And as the wind whispered through the flags above, Aurora realized something she hadn't in years, that heroes don't always wear medals. Sometimes, they wear dust, carry mops, and walk among the living quietly. Unseen, Aurora Kane didn't go home that night. She sat alone in her office long after the lights in the building had dimmed and the footsteps in the hallways had disappeared. The words Mark had spoken echoed endlessly in her mind. He was betrayed, Aurora. We both were. That sentence kept playing again and again like a broken record, refusing to fade. She stared at the memorial wall photograph on her desk, her husband David smiling in his uniform beside his team. She ran her fingers over his face, her throat tight. Betrayed? By who? She thought. David had died believing in his command, in his country, in truth. If Mark was right, then everything she had built her life on, every salute, every order, every medal, might be a lie. The rain outside had started to fall, slow at first, then heavier, streaking the glass like tears. Aurora turned to her computer and opened the classified network again, this time bypassing security protocols with her override codes. Her position gave her near top-level clearance. She typed in Operation Silent Dusk, the same mission name from Mark's file. The screen flickered, and lines of data appeared, most redacted, but enough to piece together fragments of what really happened. Her breath caught as she read, "Mission compromised due to internal leak. Extraction cancelled by command under containment protocol. Survivors not authorized for recovery." Her pulse quickened. Containment protocol? That meant command had ordered no rescue. They had deliberately left the Ghost Hawks to die. She leaned back in her chair, eyes wide, disbelief hardening into rage. "They abandoned them," she whispered. "They left them to die." She scrolled down, reading more, witness statements, transmission logs, fragments of radio calls marked distorted. One audio file caught her attention, time-stamped minutes before the Ghost Hawks disappeared. She clicked it. The static-filled voice of a man came through, rough and strained. "This is Shadow 1. Command, we have hostages secured. Repeat, secured. Request immediate evac. Enemy fire heavy. We can't hold much longer. Where's extraction?" "Command? Do you copy?" "Command, respond." Then, silence, followed by a faint explosion. The recording ended. Aurora covered her mouth, tears filling her eyes. She knew that voice. It was Mark's. She sat frozen for several minutes. The office was quiet except for the soft rumble of thunder outside. Finally, she whispered, "They lied to me, to everyone." In that moment, something shifted inside her. Something that had been buried under years of discipline and duty. Anger. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that burns cold and slow. She stood, grabbed her coat, and left her office, heading straight for the top floor where the regional commander worked. The guard outside the door hesitated when she approached. "General Kane, the commander isn't expecting." "He will," she said sharply. Inside, the commander, a gray-haired man named Briggs, looked up from his desk, surprised. "Aurora? It's past midnight. What's going on?" She didn't salute. "I want to know why Operation Silent Dusk was buried." He frowned. "That's a closed case, classified above your clearance." She slammed the file onto his desk. "Don't lie to me. You knew they were alive. You heard the transmissions. You left them there." Briggs's face hardened. "Watch your tone, General." "Don't you dare tell me to watch my tone," she snapped. "Those men were heroes, including my husband." Her voice cracked at the last word, raw and shaking. Briggs leaned back, sighing. "You don't understand what was at stake. That mission wasn't about rescuing hostages. It was about containing what they found. We couldn't risk it falling into the wrong hands." Aurora's eyes widened. "So you sacrificed them?" He said nothing. Her voice broke. "You killed them to protect your reputation." Briggs stood slowly, his expression dark. "You're treading dangerous ground, Aurora. You have a career to protect." She took a step forward. "My career means nothing if it's built on lies. Those men died believing someone was coming for them. You made sure no one did." Briggs's tone turned cold. "Drop this. For your own sake." She glared at him. "I can't. Not anymore." When she left his office, her legs felt weak, her hands shaking, but her purpose was clear. She walked straight to the archives again, this time pulling the full Ghost Hawks personnel file. She flipped through every page, scanning names, details, and mission notes. Then she found something that made her freeze. Attached to the final page was a photograph taken years ago, a group of soldiers standing beside a transport helicopter. Among them were David and Mark. Behind them, on a crate, the faint symbol of the Ghost Hawks could be seen. But what caught her attention was the man standing slightly apart from the group. Commander Briggs, younger then, wearing the same insignia. Her blood ran cold. He had been their mission commander. He hadn't told her that. Her grip tightened around the photo until the edge cut her palm. She whispered, "You were there." That night, unable to bear the walls of her office, Aurora drove out to the edge of the old base where the Ghost Hawks Memorial stood. Rain poured down in sheets, soaking her uniform, but she didn't care. She walked to the black stone and placed her hand against it. I'm sorry, she whispered, voice trembling. I should have known. Behind her, a voice came softly through the rain. You couldn't have. She turned. Mark stood there, holding an umbrella, water dripping down his jacket. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried that same quiet pain she had seen before. You shouldn't be out here, he said gently. Aurora's eyes filled with tears. You were right. They left you. They left all of you. He didn't answer, just nodded slightly. It's not the first time soldiers were forgotten. Her voice cracked. Why didn't you tell me? Why let them keep lying? Mark's jaw tightened. Because truth in the wrong hands becomes a weapon. I wasn't protecting them, Aurora. I was protecting you. Me? She said, confused. He stepped closer, lowering the umbrella between them so the rain fell around them like a curtain. Your husband knew the mission was compromised. He told me to keep you out of it. If Command knew you found out, they'd silence you too. That's why I stayed close, not as a soldier, not as a friend, but as your shadow. Aurora's tears mixed with the rain. All this time, you carried that alone. He nodded quietly. We all carry ghosts. I just learned to live with mine. The storm thundered overhead, the lightning flashing across his face. A man haunted, yet standing unbroken. Aurora reached out, touching his arm gently. You can't keep hiding forever, Mark. The truth has to come out. He looked at her with that calm, steady gaze. When it does, the world won't see a hero. They'll see a man who broke orders. Then let them, she said fiercely. Because I see a man who kept his promise. For the first time, his expression softened, a faint smile touching his lips. You sound like him, he murmured. She wiped her eyes. Maybe that's because I finally understand him. They stood there in silence for a long time, two people bound by memory and betrayal, surrounded by the rain that washed the lies of a decade into the earth. As they turned to leave, Aurora looked back once more at the memorial. The engraved names gleamed under the lightning. She whispered under her breath, I'll make them remember you. All of you. And beside her, Mark said quietly, then maybe this time, justice won't come too late. Aurora Kane didn't report to the morning briefing the next day. She sat alone in her car outside the base, watching the soldiers march past in formation, their voices echoing in rhythm, the same discipline that once made her proud now sounding hollow. She had spent the night replaying every word, every lie, every decision that had led to the ghost hawks being forgotten. She thought of her husband's smile, of Mark's haunted eyes, of the voice recording she had listened to over and over again. That final desperate call for extraction that Command ignored. She had sworn an oath to protect the truth, but now she realized the truth was what her superiors had feared most. She couldn't sit in silence anymore. When she finally stepped out of the car, the sun was climbing high, its light sharp and merciless, cutting through her indecision. Inside the building, officers moved aside as she passed, her expression distant, her uniform soaked with rain from the night before. Some whispered she looked different, not angry, not tired, but dangerous in a quiet way. She went straight to the records room, knowing Mark would be there. He was always there, early as usual, cleaning the hallways that once shined with medals and lies. When he saw her, he stopped mopping, his eyes questioning but calm. You didn't have to come back, he said softly. Aurora stepped closer, her voice trembling but steady. I read everything. The containment protocol. The audio logs. The real mission file. I know now what happened. And I know who gave the order. Mark's face didn't change, but a flicker of pain crossed his eyes. Then you also know what happens to people who dig too deep. I'm not afraid, she said. I've been afraid for too long. He looked at her for a long moment, then leaned his mop against the wall and said quietly, then you're ready to see the rest. He led her to a small storage room near the basement, one that had long been forgotten by everyone else. Inside, behind shelves stacked with old cleaning supplies, Mark pulled out a steel lockbox. The lid creaked as he opened it, revealing faded photographs, worn dog tags, and a small black drive. Aurora recognized one of the dog tags immediately. It belonged to her husband. Her hands shook as she picked it up, the metal cold against her skin. "I found them," Mark said quietly. "After the blast, I searched for days. I couldn't save everyone, but I couldn't leave them behind either. So I took what I could, their names, their tags, their story. I promised myself that one day, someone would know the truth." Aurora's voice was barely a whisper. "Why keep this hidden?" "Because," he said softly, "truth is only powerful when people are ready to face it. And back then, no one wanted to. They wanted heroes to die clean, not be left behind in the dirt." Aurora stared at the drive, her heart pounding. "What's on it?" Mark hesitated, then said, "Everything. Mission footage. The transmission logs. Even the last video we sent before command cut the signal." She looked at him, eyes wide. "You have proof?" He nodded. "Enough to bring down the entire chain of command." She took a deep breath, her mind spinning. "Then let's do it. Let's bring it all out." Mark shook his head slowly. "It's not that simple. They'll come for us before the truth ever reaches daylight. You've seen how they protect their image." "Then let them come," she said fiercely. "I've lived under their rules my whole career. I've done everything by the book, and all it gave me was a folded flag and a lifetime of silence. I won't hide anymore." Mark watched her, and for the first time, he saw not the sharp, commanding general he once avoided, but the woman his friend had loved, strong, unbreakable, and finally awake. "He'd be proud of you," he said quietly. Her eyes softened. He already was. That afternoon, Aurora and Mark met in her office to prepare the files. She decrypted the data drive while he sat silently across the table, the hum of the computer filling the air. As the screen flickered to life, the first video appeared. Grainy, chaotic, soldiers shouting orders under fire, smoke rising in the distance. Aurora covered her mouth, recognizing her husband's voice through the static, yelling, "Move! Get them to the chopper!" The image blurred, then stabilized, and there was Mark, younger, covered in dirt, dragging a wounded man through gunfire. She watched in silence, tears streaming down her cheeks, as the last few minutes played. The explosion, the comms silence, and finally the sound of Mark calling for help that never came. When the video ended, neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Mark said quietly, "Now you know why I never wanted to come back." Aurora turned to him, her face streaked with tears. "You didn't just survive, Mark. You carried all of them with you. Every name, every memory." He looked down. "That's the burden of the living." She reached across the table, placing her hand on his. "Then let's make sure they didn't die for nothing." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "If we do this, there's no going back." "I'm not going back," she said. By evening, they had compiled everything, mission files, video evidence, the list of falsified reports. Aurora sent an encrypted message to an independent military tribunal known for investigating corruption. "If we disappear," she said quietly, "these files will surface automatically." Mark smiled faintly. "You've thought this through." "I've been thinking about it for 10 years, she said. As night fell, they stood together near the base courtyard. The wind was cool, the flags above rustling softly in the dark. "When this comes out," Mark said, "people will finally know the truth about what happened that day." Aurora nodded, her eyes on the horizon. "And maybe they'll finally remember the names on that wall as more than just symbols." Mark looked at her, pride in his tired eyes. "You've got his fire," he said softly. "Your husband." She smiled sadly. "And you've still got his heart." Suddenly, footsteps echoed from the shadows. They turned. 2 military police officers approached, their expressions cold, hands on their weapons. "General Kane, you're wanted for questioning by command," one said flatly. Mark stepped forward instinctively, his stance changing. Quiet, controlled, dangerous. Aurora raised a hand. "It's okay," she said calmly. "They were going to come sooner or later." Mark's eyes hardened. "You don't have to face them alone." She looked at him with a faint, tired smile. I'm not. The officers led them toward the administrative building. Lights glowed in every window. Command was waiting. As they walked, Mark glanced up at the night sky, the stars faint above the city's glare. He thought of his team, of the ghosts who had followed him all these years. Maybe tonight, he thought, they'll finally rest. Aurora's voice broke the silence. Whatever happens in there, don't lose yourself again, Mark. You spent years in the dark. Don't go back. He looked at her, and for the first time in years, there was peace in his eyes. I won't, he said. Not this time. And as they stepped into the light of the building's entrance, the automatic doors sliding open with a soft hiss, the storm outside finally began to break. The rain that followed didn't feel like sorrow anymore. It felt like cleansing, as if the sky itself was washing away 10 years of silence and sin. Inside those walls, the past had returned, and this time, it wasn't leaving quietly. The interrogation room was small, cold, and silent except for the low hum of the ceiling light. Aurora sat at one end of the metal table, hands folded, her uniform damp from the rain, her eyes steady but unreadable. Across from her sat Commander Briggs, the man who had once led heroes into battle and then buried them under lies. Between them lay a folder thick with classified pages, the same pages she had unsealed, the same truth that could burn an empire. Mark stood behind her, quiet, his posture calm but alert, like an old soldier returning to the battlefield for the final time. Briggs looked at him and sneered faintly. So the ghost finally decided to show his face. Mark didn't reply. He just stood there, the faint hum of anger beneath his stillness. Briggs turned to Aurora. You've lost your mind, General. You think anyone will believe the word of a janitor and a woman who's letting grief cloud her judgment. Aurora's voice was cold and sharp. Grief doesn't cloud judgment, Commander. It clears it. Briggs chuckled. You don't understand the machine you're fighting. You expose this, you destroy your own career, your own legacy. She leaned forward, eyes fierce. Then let it burn. I won't stand on the ashes of men you killed. He slammed his fist on the table. Enough. The sound echoed, but neither of them flinched. Mark took a slow step forward, his voice low and quiet, the kind that carried more power than a shout. You left us out there, he said. Briggs didn't look at him. Containment order. Necessary loss. You called it containment, Mark continued, his eyes steady. I called it murder. Briggs's jaw clenched. You disobeyed orders. You broke protocol. You went dark. Mark took another step closer, his tone cutting through the silence. We went dark because you turned off the lights. Aurora looked at him, her chest tight, every word he spoke like a heartbeat pounding in the stillness. Briggs stood, anger rising. You were supposed to die out there. You were already a liability. The words slipped out before he realized how they sounded, and Aurora's eyes widened. You wanted them dead, she whispered. Briggs froze. I did what I had to for national security. No, she said softly. You did what you had to for yourself. She pulled the flash drive from her pocket and slid it across the table. Every lie you told is on this. Every voice you ignored. Every life you erased. Briggs stared at it, his face pale. You don't know what you're playing with. Mark finally spoke, stepping forward until he was face to face with the man who had abandoned him a decade ago. His voice was calm, almost sorrowful. You think I care about playing games? I buried my brothers because of you. I scrubbed the blood of their names off your floors while you gave speeches about honor. He leaned in slightly, eyes like steel. You don't get to talk about honor. Briggs looked away, unable to meet his gaze. The room fell silent. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of 10 years hung between them like a storm about to break. Then Aurora stood, her voice low but steady. You'll answer for this, Briggs. Every soldier you forgot will finally be remembered. Briggs laughed bitterly. You think the world cares? The system buries truth faster than you can speak it. Aurora turned toward the door. Then maybe it's time the system heard the ghosts knocking. She nodded to Mark, who opened the door. Outside, 2 tribunal officers stood waiting. Aurora handed them the drive. Deliver this to the Oversight Council. Directly. The officers saluted and walked away, the sound of their boots echoing down the hallway like a final verdict. Briggs sank into his chair, his defiance fading. You think you've won, he muttered. Aurora looked back at him, her voice soft, almost pitying. This was never about winning. It was about truth. She turned to leave, but Briggs spoke again, his tone trembling. You'll be erased for this. They'll strip your rank, your records, everything. She paused at the door. Then I'll be like him, she said, glancing at Mark. Invisible, but free. Briggs looked at Mark one last time, his voice breaking slightly. You could have stayed dead. You could have let it go. Mark's eyes softened with quiet sadness. I did die that day. What came back wasn't the same man. It was what was left when you take everything from someone except his promise. When they stepped out into the hallway, the air felt lighter, though the sky outside was still gray. Soldiers passed, some saluting, some whispering, the rumor already spreading through the base like wildfire. The Ghost Hawks weren't traitors, they were heroes betrayed by their own. Aurora and Mark walked side by side in silence until they reached the courtyard. Rain had started again, falling softly over the memorial wall. She stopped, turning to him. It's done. He shook his head slightly. No, it's just beginning. She looked up at the names on the wall, the engraved letters glistening under the rain. When they read this in the news, the world will know what they did. Mark's voice was quiet. The world forgets fast, Aurora. But the people who were saved because of them, they'll remember forever. For a long time they stood there, the silence filled only by the sound of rain. Then Aurora said softly, he would have been proud of you. Mark's lips curved into a faint, tired smile. He already was. She took a deep breath, wiping the rain from her face, though her eyes were wet for another reason. What will you do now? He looked out over the courtyard, the flags swaying gently in the wind. What I've always done. He said, keep the place clean. She smiled faintly. You mean the world? He nodded. That too. As she turned to leave, she stopped once more and looked back. You know, she said, her voice soft. When I first saw you, I thought you were just some old janitor. He met her gaze. And now? Now, she said, I see the man who never left. Then she walked away, her step steady, her figure fading into the mist like the past finally letting go. Mark stood alone before the wall, the rain tracing down his face, blending with the tears he didn't bother to hide. He whispered to the engraved names, you can rest now, boys. It's over. For the first time in 10 years, his voice didn't tremble. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled one last time, low and fading, as if the storm itself was bowing out. And when Mark finally turned to leave, the old watch on his wrist, the one that had stopped the day of the explosion, ticked once more, a single soft click breaking the silence. It was faint, almost impossible to hear, but to him, it was enough. The ghosts of the past had spoken, the truth had been heard, and the man the world had forgotten walked away under the falling rain, not as a janitor, not as a soldier, but as a survivor who had finally kept his promise. Days turned into weeks after the confrontation, and the storm that had shaken the base slowly began to fade, but the echoes of that day didn't disappear. News spread quietly at first, whispers among soldiers, messages between veterans, then finally headlines that broke through the silence. Ghost Hawks cleared of all charges, new investigation exposes command betrayal, fallen heroes restored. Aurora Kane's name appeared beside every headline, along with one that no one expected, former janitor identified as war hero, Captain Mark Reynolds. For years, his story had been buried beneath dust and dishonor, but now the world finally spoke it aloud. The base where he once mopped floors now carried a memorial wing in honor of his unit. The same officers who used to laugh when he passed now stood silent when they saw him, some saluting, some unable to meet his eyes. But Mark never cared for glory. He cared for truth, and now that it had come out, he found no satisfaction, only peace. He still came to the base early every morning, though now he didn't wear the old uniform with its faded patch. He wore a plain shirt, his sleeves rolled up, the tattoo of the ghost hawks no longer hidden but proudly visible on his skin. When young recruits passed him, they sometimes whispered or smiled shyly. One or two even stopped to ask questions. "Sir, were you really one of them?" And Mark would only smile and say, "I was one of many, son. The best of them are still watching from above." He spoke softly, but there was a strength in his calm, a kind of wisdom that didn't come from books or orders but from carrying the weight of memory and still choosing kindness anyway. Aurora often visited him during those mornings. She no longer wore her general's insignia. She had resigned after the tribunal, leaving behind the ranks and politics that had once defined her. She had traded medals for purpose, command for peace. Together, they walked the quiet halls of the memorial building, walls lined with photos of the fallen ghost hawks. She often found him standing before one particular photograph, the one showing her husband, smiling beside him in the desert sun. One morning, as sunlight poured through the glass ceiling, Aurora stood beside Mark, watching the light wash over the faces on the wall. "They finally got what they deserved," she said softly. Mark shook his head. "No one deserves to die like they did. But at least now they're remembered for how they lived." She looked at him, her voice trembling slightly. "You could have taken everything back, your rank, your medals, your honor. But you didn't." Mark smiled faintly, the lines around his eyes deepening. "I already had my honor. I just wanted them to have theirs too." She nodded, understanding the quiet dignity in his words. "You know," she said after a pause, "David used to say you were the best soldier he'd ever known." Mark looked at the photo again, his expression soft. He was wrong. He was the best man I ever knew. Aurora's eyes glistened. "He'd be proud of both of us." Mark's voice dropped, barely above a whisper. "Maybe now, he can finally rest." Outside, the courtyard had changed. The broken concrete where weeds once grew was replaced by a small garden, planted by volunteers, watered by recruits who never knew the ghost hawks but had learned to respect their story. A statue stood in the center, a simple bronze figure of a soldier standing tall, head bowed slightly, not in victory but in remembrance. At the base of the statue was a plaque engraved with the words, "For those who were forgotten, but never truly gone." Mark often sat on the bench near the statue after work, the same way he used to sit on empty supply crates in the field years ago. Aurora sometimes joined him, bringing 2 cups of coffee, black for him, sweet for her. They would sit there in silence, watching the young soldiers train, laughing, shouting, alive. Mark found comfort in that sound. It was proof that life went on, that the world still moved even after loss. "You ever think about leaving?" Aurora asked one evening as the sun dipped low. He smiled without looking up. "I left once," he said quietly. "Didn't like what I found out there." She smiled faintly. "So you're staying?" He nodded. "Someone's got to make sure this place stays clean." She laughed softly. "You really can't stop being a janitor, can you?" He smiled back. "No. I just changed what I clean up." As the days passed, the world slowly forgot the noise, as it always does, but within the base, his story stayed alive in whispers and respect. On the anniversary of the Ghost Hawk's last mission, the base held a small ceremony. Aurora gave the speech, her voice steady and filled with grace. When she finished, she turned to Mark and handed him a folded flag, the same flag that had once draped over an empty casket. "You kept your promise," she said softly. "To him, to them, and to yourself." Mark took the flag in his hands, his eyes misty but his heart light. "We all did," he said quietly. That night, long after everyone had gone, Mark walked alone through the empty courtyard. The lights of the memorial shimmered faintly on the polished stone, the engraved names gleaming under the moonlight. He stopped before the wall one last time and placed his palm against it. "You can rest now," he whispered. "The world finally remembers." A cool breeze passed through the courtyard, rustling the leaves of the trees like a gentle reply. He smiled, closed his eyes, and stood there for a long moment, listening to the soft hum of the night, the sound of peace earned, not given. When he finally turned to leave, the moonlight caught his tattoo, the ink shining faintly like a scar healed by time. The same tattoo that once drew laughter now carried reverence, a mark not of shame but of survival. He walked out of the courtyard slowly, the sound of his footsteps soft on the clean stone path. And as the night air wrapped around him, something in his chest felt lighter, as if the ghosts that once haunted him were walking beside him now, no longer as reminders of pain, but as friends finally home. The next morning, when the young recruits arrived for duty, they found a single note left on the bench near the statue, written in a steady, simple hand, "Heroes never leave. They just fade into peace." There was no name, no signature, just the quiet truth of a man who had carried the weight of silence and finally laid it down. And somewhere beyond the horizon, under a calm sky free of thunder, the world felt a little cleaner, a little kinder, because a man named Mark Reynolds, the janitor everyone once laughed at, had reminded it what honor truly meant. That IT had been 6 months since the world had learned the truth, and the base where the Ghost Hawks once trained had become more than a station of duty. It was a place of remembrance. Every morning, sunlight poured over the memorial courtyard like gold, touching the names carved into the black stone, the garden blooming where sorrow once grew. The story of the janitor who was once a soldier had become legend, not in newspapers or reports, but in whispers that carried between generations of young recruits. They said if you came early enough, before sunrise, you could still see him walking the corridors, his mop squeaking softly, humming an old tune only soldiers knew. But in truth, Mark Reynolds no longer worked there. A few weeks after the ceremony, he had quietly resigned, leaving no speech, no farewell, just a small letter on Aurora's desk that said simply, "I've cleaned all I can. It's your turn now." She had held that note for hours, her hands shaking as she read it over and over, feeling both grief and pride tangled together like roots that refused to let go. Mark had moved far away, to the countryside where the noise of engines was replaced by the sound of wind and birds. He bought a small cottage near the edge of a river, with a single rocking chair on the porch and wildflowers growing along the fence. It was peaceful there, the kind of peace he hadn't known since before the war. Every morning, he brewed his coffee and sat by the riverbank, watching the reflection of the sunrise dance across the water. Sometimes he spoke softly, as if to unseen friends. "You'd like it here," he would say. "Quiet. Clean. No orders. No lies." He kept a small box beside his chair, the same steel lockbox that had once held the Ghost Hawks dog tags. Inside now were only 2 things, his captain's insignia, and the old wristwatch that had stopped during the explosion so many years ago. One evening, as the light faded and the first stars appeared, he took the watch from the box and turned it over in his hand. The glass was cracked, but the hand still pointed to the same moment it had stopped, the moment everything had ended and begun again. "You can rest now," he whispered, setting it down on the table. "We all can." Aurora visited him one last time that autumn. The leaves had turned gold, the air smelled of rain, and the river was calm. She walked up the path and found him sitting quietly, his eyes on the horizon. He smiled when he saw her, that same quiet, steady smile she had come to know. "You found me," he said softly. "You left without saying goodbye," she replied, her voice trembling. He chuckled. "Goodbyes are for endings. I was just moving on." They sat together for a long time, talking about small things, about how the recruits were learning, how the memorial garden was thriving, how the base had started new programs named after the Ghost Hawks. Aurora told him that his story had changed people, made them kinder, made them listen. Mark only smiled faintly and said, "If even one person remembers to look at a janitor with respect, then it was all worth it." As the evening sun dipped below the trees, painting the sky in soft orange and blue, Aurora noticed his eyes drifting toward the river, distant but peaceful. "You know," she said quietly, "David used to say heroes don't die, they just fade into the horizon." Mark's lips curved gently. "Then I guess I'm almost there." She blinked back tears. "You're still the same stubborn man he trusted." He nodded slowly. "And you're the same strong woman he loved." For a moment, silence stretched between them, Not heavy, just full, like a pause between heartbeats. Then Aurora reached into her coat and placed a small folded flag on the table beside him. "This belongs to you," she said. "It always did." Mark looked at it, his eyes soft, the corners glistening under the sunset. "Thank you," he whispered. That night, when the stars filled the sky, Aurora left the cottage and walked back down the path, turning once to see him still sitting there, the flag resting on his lap, the breeze playing with his silver hair. She smiled sadly and whispered, "Goodbye, Captain." The next morning, the cottage was silent. The chair still rocked gently in the wind, and the flag still lay folded neatly where she had left it. On the table beside it was a note, written in Mark's familiar steady hand, "Don't grieve for me. I never really left. Every place that needed cleaning, every lie that needed truth, every name that needed remembering, I've already been there." When the news reached the base, a soft quiet settled over the halls. No announcement, no trumpet, no parade. Just silence. Aurora stood by the memorial wall once more, her hand resting on his name now freshly engraved beneath the others. Captain Mark Reynolds, the one who stayed. She whispered, "You kept your promise till the end." And as she turned to leave, a soft breeze swept through the courtyard, rustling the flags, making them shimmer in the sunlight like wings taking flight. She smiled through tears, knowing somehow that the ghost hawks were all together again. Finally home, finally free. Far beyond the base, in the quiet countryside, the river kept flowing gently by the old cottage. The watch on the table ticked once, then stopped again, not from failure, but from peace. And for the first time in decades, the world felt lighter, because somewhere out there, a forgotten soldier had finally found rest.